An important aspect of transnational crime and international criminal justice is how do you get global consensus on important issues? Because in the U.S. we call them civil rights, around the world we call them human rights. But that is, you have the right. In the U.S. the rights are written right into the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. That is, you have right as a human being, regardless of what country you happen to find yourself in. So there's certain natural rights that everybody has. So the question is, what's the best way to get countries to reach consensus on those rights and to make sure folks are not exploited by just the luck of being in a country that does not respect those rights? Well, the United Nations has been a center force in this. Again, the UN was established right after World War II as a way to get the countries around the world to talk about things rather than fight about things. But I just want to talk very briefly about the way we treat juveniles around the world. And there's been a number of international conventions regarding the rights of juveniles. The most important of which is the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which is the most widely subscribed to convention in the world, that shows how juveniles ought to be treated. And there's been other rules through various UN crime congresses, the Beijing rules, Havana rules, on the rights of juveniles in the juvenile justice system, and all that kind of thing. That is, we should treat juveniles under law differently than we treat adults. There's global consensus on that. But the consensus should be, how should they be treated? And when you look at these rules that have been agreed to by most countries on the planet, the rules deal with things such as corporal punishment should be prohibited everywhere. Juveniles should not be subject to capital punishment. Incarceration of juveniles should be a last resort. Rehabilitation of juveniles should be an overriding objective because you shouldn't be giving up on people at age 15. So it should be an overriding objective, perhaps more so than adults. Juveniles should have the right to due process, the right to consult with legal counsel, all these kinds of things, some of which we take for granted in some countries, but the rest of the world, these are emerging concepts. That is, you're treating juveniles as a human entity and not as property of their parents or not as someone who has no rights under the law. So when you look at these rules are promulgated by international consensus. Then after the rules are established, the UN and other countries develop guidelines and toolkits. How do you implement these rules into your country, into your laws, your legislation, your training of criminal justice practitioners, and so forth? Then the next step is you incorporate these things in international law. So international law provides the umbrella, but then each nation of the 193 UN nations must incorporate these in their law to make sure that they are each treating juveniles with the same respect for human rights as every other country is doing. The next step is, of course, evaluating how well this is happening in practice. And there's been a number of evaluation studies, and this is where research and practice meet, because researchers tend to be the ones doing the evaluation studies of how, in fact, juveniles are treated. And there's been studies in many parts of the world, Lebanon and the U.S. and Europe and Asia, in many countries, and there's a lot of variation going on. So even though there's consensus on principles of how juveniles should be treating, getting it to work in practice has been a problem. And for example, in a number of countries, there's still juveniles being incarcerated with adults or put in detention with adults. That's a violation of all these international agreements. Everybody realizes that should not happen. Everybody agrees it should not happen. Juveniles should be in detention separately from adults when they are in detention. But evaluations have shown this is still happening in other countries. And the emphasis on rehabilitation. Juveniles are going to be back on the street one day. You want them to be in better shape they were when they came in. In a number of countries, the emphasis on rehabilitation, that is getting them to a state where they can function as productive citizens in society, is not being emphasized. So the question is, consensus principles, trying to implement in practice, then evaluations show, well, in practice, there's a lot of variation. We're not doing as well as we ought to be doing. what I argue for is that what we have to do is provide incentives for countries to do this. For example, in a number of countries around the world, let's look at hospitals. If a hospital releases you as a patient and you are readmitted within 30 days, in a number of countries, the hospital must pay a readmission penalty. In other words, they released you when they shouldn't have because you're back in the hospital in 30 days. That increases the costs to you and to society. So we want hospitals to treat you effectively and then let you go. And a number of countries, to get at that, for hospitals just not treating you and throwing you out the door, they say, will you pay a penalty if somebody's readmitted within 30 days? And we don't do anything like that in criminal justice. So what I'm arguing for is that jurisdictions, cities, counties, towns, villages, states, countries that show that they are not being effective in what they're doing. They're not being effective in their rehabilitation efforts. They're not being effective in complying with law. I would argue they should have to pay a penalty because right now there is no penalty. If you run a juvenile detention facility now and the recidivism rate is 80%, that is 80% of the juveniles who are released get back to your facility one day, well, you're doing a horrible job, right? You're not doing a very good job. And I would argue there's no penalty for that. You just keep going on. Your agency keeps getting funded, your institution keeps getting funding. I would argue there should be a penalty. Maybe your budget gets reduced or somehow you should not be rewarded for being ineffective, and you should not be rewarded by keeping your budget and your people for not complying with international rules or national laws. So what I'm arguing here is how do we turn principles into practice? In the case of juvenile justice, there is global consensus on how juveniles ought to be treated. There's global efforts within and across countries transnationally in terms of how we should implement those rules. The evaluation results have showed that the implementation around the world is kind of spotty, as it is, within some countries. So you have implementations out there, and I would argue the fourth step should be we should hold people accountable when their implementation is not meeting those principles that we've already agreed upon. So to summarize, when we're talking about transnational crime, international issues of any kind, the first step is reaching international consensus on how we ought to be acting. Then we have to have mechanisms for implementing that. Then we have to evaluate that implementation in practice. And then the fourth step, which we haven't gotten to, but I argue we should get to, is then holding individual cities, states, counties, and nations accountable for the results of their actions in practice.